nothing like the music stopping to be like, ooh, something's about to happen. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Positive Light Projects. My name is Sarah Campbell. I'm the Associate Director for Arts and Culture at the University of Exeter. And thank you very much for coming along tonight to Embodied Labour, where we'll be learning more about Adam Garratt's work and Laura Porter's. And this opportunity has come about because Adam has a show opening next month, 22nd of April, get it in your diaries, at Studio Kind, where Laura is a co-director. So the format this evening is that I'm just going to run through some brief biogs for a bit of context. Then both Laura and Adam are going to talk about their work with some lovely visuals, and then I will we'll have some Q&A questions together, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So do sort of start brewing away on what things you might want to ask. So very briefly, arts and culture is a strategy at the university. Many of the team members are here this evening, and the purpose of arts and culture is really to join things up around creativity. So we work with staff and students across the 4 campuses of the university in Devon and Cornwall, and we work with cultural sector and creative practitioners in Devon and Cornwall. And our core aims are really supporting creativity and creative practice, and we're really keen to tell the stories of creative process, how ideas are developed, and interdisciplinary working. So we love arts and not arts coming together, and we try to promote those things as much as we can. And arts and culture, from our website, we do lots of different things, but having the opportunity to support this particular exhibition, supporting both Studio Kind and Adam's show is just a real joy. So that's why I'm here. So I'm just going to give, there are certain words in a certain order, so apologies for reading, but I'll be brief. So Laura Porter is the founding director and curator of Studio Kind, CIC, which is an artist-led space in Braunton, North Devon. Having set up the gallery in 2020, which was obviously a good year in so many ways, alongside co-director Richard Gregory, Laura has championed art from the Southwest and brought culturally significant work to their village location from across the UK more widely. Running a diverse program including collaborations with Plymouth's Cast Gallery, working with local schools, and more recently working with Arts and Culture to bring Adam's exhibition to Studio Kind, Laura has been juggling the gallery with her own practice as a textiles, sculpture and installation artist. Working with discarded clothing, a material that carries with it cyclical histories of land, worker, consumer and waste, Laura breaks down the garments to create a raw material that is reformed into solid structures, which are often a response to the environments in which she works. Intrinsically grounded in the traditions of craft and textiles art, Laura's practice pushes back against an automated, digitized world and hierarchies of labour and material, instead placing value in slow, low-tech processes performed by her own body as a renewable energy source. Adam's practice has evolved around constraints of space, the use of material and artistic process. Much of the work is made on reclaimed materials and is specifically made to expand into an installation when it is not neatly folded or stacked in storage. The repeat process of screen printing in Adam's work is a labour that provides a mass and aesthetic that reflects his working class background. In Adam's recent printed work, there is an exploration of how the use of unusual material and display techniques can influence the value in his printmaking. The work also speaks of the material's former use and how it can be represented in an artistic setting. So that's the long words version. And so I'll hand over to Laura first and then Adam to talk about their work.
Oh, thank you. And before I start, I do just want to say a massive thank you to Sarah, who's been a huge support to both of us, and Studio Kind, and Naomi and all the team at Arts and Culture, who have helped us have this event and a lot of other things. So thank you so much, and thanks for coming as well. So I'm kind of here with 2 hats on, in a way, although I kind of see them as one hat, one large hat. But yeah, so I've got my own practice, as well as running Studio Kind. We're an artist-led space, so I guess being an artist is still really As Sarah mentioned, we set up in 2020, so we're still a relatively new project, up in Braunton in North Devon. Someone the other day said to me they didn't know where North Devon was, but hopefully people here do. But yeah, so I lived in North Devon for 6 years, I think, before setting up Studio Kind. I went to university in London from 2011 to 2014, and then in 2014 is when I moved to North Devon. And I was really working kind of in isolation, out of my bedroom or various sheds and garages. It took me about 5 years to realise, yeah, there are just no artist studios in North Devon. I kept thinking, I'm going to find one somewhere. But yeah, I'd really rely on kind of travelling to Bristol or, you know, London or Leeds and other places to exhibit. And I always felt like North Devon was really just the place that I would come home to and make work. And then I would make connections with other artists elsewhere. So it was really kind of, it fell on my lap a bit, Studio Kind. It was at the end of summer 2020 when it looked like things were starting to become a bit more normal. And Richard Gregory, who I set Studio Kind up with, said, I've got this space that I work out of. He is a printmaker, but he also has a film like practice, but also kind of commercial aspect of it. So he did a bit of both. And he was working out this kind of industrial unit out the back of Tesco in Braunton. We are in the Tesco building, effectively. It's very glamorous. And he said, you know, I've been really thinking about what I'm doing with this big space, because he was working in there on his own for the first time. And he said, and I thought an art gallery would be really good for the village. And I was like, yes, please. And he asked if I would be interested in kind of setting it up with him. We kind of sat down, thought about what we would want that to look like, what we thought the area was lacking, and kind of, yeah, how we'd want to formulate that. In fact, I'll get a photo up of Studio Kind. Here we go. So we set it up as a community interest company, which was really important to us that it was a not-for-profit. We kind of identified 3 key areas that we wanted to focus on, which was art and learning, where we really wanted to be able to have a program of kind of workshops and also engage in all the local schools. Art and culture, because we really wanted to bring some kind of culturally relevant exhibitions to our location rather than relying on travelling kind of really further afield. And North Devon's not well connected, so travelling to see exhibitions was kind of costly and time consuming. So we really wanted to bring some projects to the area that we thought were really kind of pushing boundaries. And then arts and community, and we really wanted it to be a space that the community could feel like they had some kind of ownership over, and also to really champion local artists as well, and people trying to make a living in the southwest, where, well, we're a priority area now, but typically there just hadn't been any kind of arts council funding available to people trying to make a living there. So with that being said, we opened in December 2020, kind of publicly, for 2 weeks with a community exhibition by a local charity called North Devon Arts. And then in January 2021, obviously went back into lockdown and we had to close again. But it was kind of weirdly a blessing in disguise, because the unit next door to us is an electrical business. And they had one of these fancy cameras that kind of do a virtual scan. I don't know the exact technological term for it, but they make like a virtual walk around the spacey thing of the gallery. So what we started to do is we'd just kind of go in there individually, hang exhibitions, and then Richard would scan them because he was a filmographer and knew how to work cameras. And we were posting up on our website all these virtual exhibitions, which weirdly meant that our audience was much bigger than we kind of ever anticipated it to be. We had people, because on the website you can see stats and stuff, we had people visiting them from kind of all over the world. We had people getting in touch with us from kind of all different parts of the country saying, oh, I loved this exhibition that you did. And even though no one had even physically been in it, it was really weird to think that people had been kind of interacting with the work and getting to see what some of the artists, because obviously it was only local artists that we were showing at that time, what they were up to. So what we thought was going to be a little gallery for people in Braunton ended up being a kind of much bigger thing. So one of the things that we really wanted to do, this exhibition is by an artist called Chris Alton, and he grew up in Braunton and attended the local primary schools and secondary schools and college before going to London to study, and he's now based in Manchester. And what we really wanted to do is find artists who are doing kind of interesting things from around the country who grew up there and kind of bring them back to the area, because one of the things that people have always said to us was, oh, you know, like we couldn't have a creative career in North Devon or in Braunton. So we kind of really wanted to create these opportunities. So we did have some people who were returning back to North Devon after university. We've shown Neve Birch and George Rayner, who were kind of recent graduates. But then we were also kind of finding people who were making work. We had Jack Hirons, who's based in Kent now, who grew up in the area, and Chris, kind of enticing them back to say, look, there's opportunity here now. And then we've also been collaborating with other arts organisations. I don't know if you can really see that very well, actually. But this is our first collaboration with Cast, which is an artist-led space in Plymouth. And when we met up with them to kind of talk about how we could do some kind of connection between artist-led spaces across the region, we came up with this idea where we gave one of their studio holders a solo exhibition, and this was by Katie Richardson, and all of this work she actually made during lockdown, and it was a video installation with a sound piece, and it was, she'd filmed it all on Zoom and filmed all the recording on Zoom, and so it was really nice to kind of bring it into a physical space. And this was an exhibition by one of our local secondary schools. It was a photography exhibition. We thought there were going to be about 50 photos arriving, and we had 250. But yeah, it's just really nice. A lot of our schools that we've worked with, most of the children who have taken part in them have said that they'd never been in an art gallery before, because if you can't afford to kind of travel to various places, you're not going to be able to access it. So it's just really nice that people can pop into Tesco, grab a pint of milk, come round, see something that's hopefully interesting. And yeah, it's been a bit of a wild ride. We're in our third year now. But for me personally, it's just been really nice to feel like I'm now part of a community, which I didn't feel like I had for a really long time. And it's meant that I've been able to meet loads of really interesting artists, especially meeting people in the Southwest who have these incredible practices that I just didn't hear about. And I suppose that's kind of how we have this relationship now, because I first came across Adam's work in the Exeter Phoenix, when you were part of the correspondence exhibition, and you'd been up to a studio kind of see Molly's show, and I was really interested in the way that Adam used printmaking as something that was much broader and much more expanded than kind of the page and the kind of 2D form. And I love this idea that printmaking can all of a sudden be sculptural and really physical. And then I really liked all of the kind of imagery as well of these kind of urban, not urban, kind of outskirty places. And it really reminded me, because I grew up in a really boring town called Maidstone in Kent. Sorry, Dad. It was horrible. No, it was fine. It was fine, but it was just very like it was very like concretey, towny. You know, it's not a city. It's not the countryside. It's like one of those areas. And so I think for me, some of the imagery in your work felt quite nostalgic in a way. But then as we were kind of talking and developing Adam's exhibition, we started to discover all these parallels between our practice. And it's the first time I've had an exhibition at Studio Kind where I felt like my practice is really kind of, I don't know, in there in some way. So it's just really nice that we get to kind of talk like this now. And so what I thought I'd do is talk to you a little bit about my work and then hand over to Adam, and hopefully we'll have some kind of really interesting conversations about those parallels. So this is actually my degree show work, so it's from back in 2013, 2014. And all of my work to date has used recycled clothing in some way. And so I really wanted to show this piece because it's the first time that I kind of used clothing in a sort of 3D form. And the way that I started using clothing was really kind of just a accidental kind of functional process in that from where I was living in Hendon in North London, and where my studio was, I'd kind of walk into uni and I would just collect all these items of clothing that I was embedding into kind of painterly surfaces. I was quite interested in like reliefs and very kind of impasto textured paintings. And so I would just start picking up the clothes and putting them onto the canvas so that it was thicker, a free way of getting really thick surfaces. And then over time I became more interested in the clothing items as kind of their own thing and the kind of essence of what they were, and I was quite interested in how they can kind of be expanded and stretched and fill space, and then they can be very, very small, and they've got this relationship with our bodies, but they're kind of very malleable, and they can shrink and they can feel very empty, but then they can like be big and they can feel very large. And yeah, I started to kind of bring them away from the canvas and then into the 3D space. I will say here they are covered in bitumen, which I would never do now because I know it's not very good for the environment, but you know, it's like when you're an art student and you're not thinking about these things. And then this is another example of using clothing, which was a residency I did in Bristol, I want to say in 2015, and here lots of local people kind of donated clothes to me, and I formed them, I cut them into their kind of individual patterns, so cut out all the seams, and then reformed them into these kind of tube shapes, which mirrored the pillars that were in this kind of shopping square thing. And they wanted to do the residency because the shopping square was being knocked down and turned into kind of luxury flats, like seems to be happening everywhere. And so I was really interested in this idea of our kind of built environment actually being very unstable and something that we can just like discard and then rebuild like as and when. And they also said that a lot of the people, because there was kind of a thoroughfare coming through here, and so it was actually really quite busy and they had a lot of passers-by, but they didn't really get anyone coming into the space and engaging with what they were showing at the time. So I suppose in a way it was a way of me creating something that was instantly recognizable, that people could have some kind of familiarity with as soon as they saw it, but also place them in the middle of the work without them having to enter the gallery space. And actually doing this where I'm taking like architectural clues and like sort of visual clues from the environment is something that is quite important to my practice still. And then I've always thought that, I think maybe because I use textiles so much and because I really like repetitive, slow, kind of low-tech processes, I've always felt like my practice is really grounded in the craft space, like the contemporary craft space. So for this, I was cutting up clothes into kind of strips, then restitching them back together. So I was creating these like really kind of big balls of yarn out of recycled clothing, and then I'd knit them back together. This was knitted using kind of like a circular loom to create a tubular shape. And I like that it had some kind of relationship to the body, but it had kind of gone through this kind of quite tactile, intimate, craftily process. And then thinking about the fact that my practice is really grounded in craft, it got me kind of thinking about labour, which is something that is both of our kind of, well, the core of both of our practices in a lot of ways. So in 2021, I went to London to do an MA, and I decided that I was going to try and create a new material. Often when I was cutting up clothes, I was creating a lot of kind of lots of scraps, and I had kind of bags and bags of what I was kind of calling the byproducts of various projects that I was doing. So I wanted to figure out a way that I could kind of use clothes so that there was just like no waste whatsoever, so every bit of the clothing kind of went into something. I kind of saw it a bit like how a butcher kind of tries to use every element of an animal, and in a kind of slightly less messy way. So I started to cut up items of clothing into tiny, tiny pieces, which was a really, really slow, long, methodical process. And actually this is a still of a video that I took of myself doing it. And I don't even know why I started filming myself cutting fabric, because they're really boring things to watch. But I think it was a way of me kind of documenting it for myself and reminding myself that, oh yeah, I did this. I sat and cut fabric for 10 hours, and it was kind of really uncomfortable and straining. And I think it was a way of kind of proving to myself that, yeah, you're not crazy, you actually did do that. So I started to think about lots of different ways that I could apply this new material, because I'd mix it with water and other sort of vegetable-based ingredients, so there's no glues used, nothing that's toxic. And it also means that I can rehydrate the material, so I can like apply it, break it all apart, and then soak it in water, and then I can reuse it. So not only is the clothes going through this kind of cycle of going from being made by people, because obviously the manufacturing of clothing is still really quite tactile. Workers are still relied on to kind of stitch clothes together, and it's kind of the worker who's been deemed the most like lowly valued part of the manufacturing process. So I wanted this cycle of the clothing garments to match the cycle of how I work with the material within my own practice. So it becomes quite clay-like once I've mixed it with water, and I can kind of apply it in lots of different ways. And I've actually brought like a sample of it with me. This was one of my first trials. There's nothing inside it. I think I've gone like that so much that it might break, but yeah, it's quite solid, and actually I put these bolts in it just to see if I could drill through it, but you can kind of pass that around if you wanted to touch it, because I really like touching things. So then a lot of the structures that I was then applying this material to, I really wanted it to have a relationship to both the maker, the person who made the clothes, and then me as a maker, as well as our kind of built environments that we're surrounded by. I started to think a lot about how energy transfers between the body and into a material, and thinking about energy not in a kind of necessarily scientific way, like it's not thermal energy, it's not kinetic energy, but thinking about energy maybe more as like a consciousness. And I'm not saying that I believe that we're passing consciousness into a material, I'm just saying, well, maybe we are, you know, it's an interesting thing to think about. And I think a lot of my work actually, in a kind of slightly odd way, I think about the post-human world and what that might look like, and how all the things that obviously are going to outlive us because we make all these different materials that are going to last however many years into the future. I like to think about how they might kind of develop and then become something that's organic but inorganic, and I don't know, it's kind of like just something that I'm presenting as an idea. So I like to think that all of these sculptures I make have this idea of growth in some way. I don't know if it's just because I got really into propagating my plants when I'm at home, but I like to think that something can continue sort of growing past my intervention or kind of any other living form. So this is kind of like a close-up of the piece that I just showed. And what's really nice is often when you see them up close, you can start to distinguish what the clothing items are. So you can start to notice, oh, that's a pair of jeans, or that's made from like a t-shirt material, or that's corduroy. So I really see the way that I work with clothing as like a collaboration. And there's this constant like push and pull. And I'm always thinking about the characteristics that I can kind of maintain and that I think are important to the kind of essence of the item and the material, and then the things that I can kind of discard. And so, yeah, I think that's why I like to think of it as a collaboration, because it's not just me kind of manipulating something. I'm thinking about what the material is and wants to be as well. And this is my current exhibition that's on at the Plough Art Centre. I don't know if anybody knows that venue, but it's in Great Torrington, in the kind of middle space of Devon. But it's a really lovely space. They've just got NPO status. They've got like a theatre and a cinema there as well, run by a really lovely local artist from North Devon called Peter Stiles. And this exhibition is called Compost, again relating to the kind of way that materials kind of break down and then reform and then potentially end up kind of giving new life to something, as well as thinking about this idea of time, because I think that the slowness of my practice is something that's kind of really important to what it is. Oh, thank you. So, yeah. That's pretty much what I do, and so I'll hand you over to Adam, and I'll just switch our PDFs. There we go.
So yes, I'm Adam. Nice to see you all. So I tend to categorise myself as an installation artist, printmaker, and someone who responds to site. So I tend to kind of have those little labels next to my name on most of my kind of social medias and things like that. And as it was said at the start of the talk, I kind of work on constraints of space, the use of materials and repetitious making processes. And those are all elements that have really been imposed on my practice. It's something that I've had to work with as a result of the kind of facilities that I've always had. And actually it reached a point a few years ago where I decided that I needed to start retaining those elements in my practice. And so they became a really kind of important part about how I made my work and how things kind of came into the way that I work. So you can see here that one of those constraints is the fact that I don't have a studio and I don't have a place to store things other than the garden shed. At the moment I don't even have this garden shed, it's kind of just a small spare room and a little space under the stairs. So being really resourceful in the way that I stored things became really important. So lots of like really neat stacks, cutting things up so that I had just what I would deem the important part of the artwork. Using ratchet straps to make sure things stayed in parcels. And then at the back, I don't know really if you can see it, but there's like a set of lockers where I kind of stuff things, and in the top you can see that there's actually some high-vis in there. So it's all about being really practical and making the most of my space, and having that kind of ordered chaos that I sort of knew how to navigate and work through. So some of those materials that you saw there include rubble bags. So this, I think it's about 30 rubble bags, and they initially took this form because I needed to get them in the boot of a car. And so ratchet strapping them until they're kind of most compact was the best way that I could do that. At the point of taking them back out of the car, I realised it was actually a really interesting form, and they ended up staying like that rather than kind of expanding into space. I think my initial idea was to just have them open and empty in the space so that people that came to see the work couldn't get into the space. It was just kind of these empty bags. But I actually took the complete opposite route and ended up showing them as a kind of solid form that was kind of squished and compact. I really enjoyed the way that all the handles came together, and they kind of gave this sense of tactileness. It was quite interesting pulling that around the space. A lot of these bags still contain some of the sand that was in them when they were used for delivery. So quite often I would be pulling them around a white floor and just leaving kind of trails of muck behind. And as I kept them in the shed, which was a favourite place for cats around the local area, so some of them smell of wee. So it's quite an interesting way to work. I also use this material, which is called Monoflex, and this is the plastic sheeting that you'll commonly see hanging off of scaffolding. I was drawn to this material partly because it's got this really lovely kind of translucent quality, and the light passes through it and it almost disappears into the space, especially in a kind of white space like that. But also it becomes a really great printing surface. It's flat, I can take it into the studio and it stores really nicely. And in its two forms that I use it kind of expands into these lovely rhythmic forms that in this case were suspended from the ceiling, or in kind of neat folds and piles on the floor, just to kind of showcase a little bit of that storage value. And here it's suspended with ratchet straps and bungee cords, so it kind of does move actually in the space. I also use tarpaulin. So tarpaulin is really useful because it's very versatile. I can put it in a backpack and I can wander off into urban areas and just see what it does when you attach it to things. So in this case it's wrapped around a rock, and I did a series of these for about a month on different things around Exeter just when I could. So I kind of just travelled with it every day in my bag just to see what I could do, and I ended up getting these really interesting forms, and I had to respond to what I found at the time. I did get a few funny looks, and at one point a neighbour asked me why our tree had a hairnet on, and it's because at that point it was the only thing I could do was wrap it around a bush in a garden. So that kind of responsiveness was something that I'd never really done before, but actually has slowly kind of drip fed into my practice. And again, it's come out of necessity of not having a studio where I can kind of practice these things in perfect light, not rainy weather. And then a lot of these materials do come together in kind of hybrid forms. So this is actually the rubble bag bale that you saw before, but I've wrapped it in Monoflex and then strapped it together to create this slightly less detailed form. The thing I like about the Monoflex, as I said, is the fact that it's translucent, so when you wrap it around something you get a sense of what's underneath without actually quite knowing what's there. So in this case it was kind of just a big form sitting in the space, and I just quite liked it in its kind of desolate spot. And then just to give you an idea of scale, and also the fact that this material can be printed on the right hand side you can see the material as it is printed on. So on one side I printed orange, and on the other side I printed black detail. So you got this lovely kind of layered effect, especially when the light comes through. This was from my master's exhibition. If you've ever been to Plymouth, there's a spot called Royal William Yard. And they have these amazing old naval docks that they've converted, and they've all got really amazing skylights and huge ceilings. And as soon as I saw the space, I kind of knew that I wanted to go up into the space, partly because that's where the materials came from. They were from high spaces on scaffolding, but also I wanted to kind of challenge myself and use the roof lights to kind of funnel the light through the work. And you can see at the back there are some sandbags, and those I printed onto about 105 sandbags that I then filled with mulch that I borrowed from a friend's farm that I then took back, and then constructed them in these kind of piled forms. So it was all about kind of borrowing things, taking them back, expanding into space, and then shrinking it back down ready for storage. So with all of that in mind, as you eloquently put, we kind of came together. I was invited to exhibit at Studio Kind, and I came up with the idea for the Embodied Labour exhibition. We've already had a bit of a spoiler alert, but this is Studio Kind. I particularly like this image, which is actually from the scan that Laura was talking about. You can kind of click on all the little dots and it zooms you around the room. But I particularly like this image because it really showcases some of the aspects of the space that really engaged me initially when I went there. So the kind of corrugated metal ceiling, the girders that are across the space, and then the really nice polished concrete floor, all kind of spoke of the materials that I was using and had those kind of qualities that I look for in a space and that kind of get me excited. So I had to start thinking about the exhibition. So from the invitation to roughly this time next month, it will be about 15 months where I've had to research and plan the work. So I set myself some goals, and one of them was to make new work using the existing materials that I had. So similar to Laura, I don't like to create extra waste. So all of the materials that I collected for my masters, all of that plastic sheeting, I kind of want to keep using it until it's used up, rather than just kind of getting rid of it and throwing it in a skip. I wanted to introduce a new element to my practice, so whether that was a new material or a new process, I wasn't too sure. I was kind of happy to just see what came around. I wanted to continue making printed work, and I wanted to make some more spatial forms, so things that could go in the space in the exhibition. The interesting thing about Studio Kind is that, as Laura said, they use the space to host events, do workshops and things like that. So for me, thinking about things to go in the space, they have to be movable because they then have to be moved out of the way so people can come and do the workshops and the talks. So I've been working on some ways of doing that, which you will see when you come to the exhibition. So I started my research, which pretty much just includes walking around, looking for materials that I use, and seeing what kind of forms they take in their natural state. So this is a piece of monoflex plastic sheeting that fell from a scaffolding actually just across the road at John Lewis, and it had obviously come from the top and fallen down and kind of created this amazing cascading shape on the floor. And it kind of twigged with me that so far I've been exploiting the texture of this material and the property of its kind of translucency by hanging it and having light come through it and seeing it, but actually this shows you both sides. When you have a print on this and you drop it on the floor potentially, you get to see all parts of the print, the back, the front, you get to see it twisted and inside out and out of shape, and I started to think about that with my work. Another thing that really grabbed me was this skip, which was actually just on the site behind this building, and it kind of struck me because the whole space was full of kind of rubble and piles of dirt and twisted bits of metal and trucks, and then all of a sudden my attention was drawn to this sleeve just hanging over the skip, which then suddenly brought in the human element for me, and it kind of really brought me into that point of, oh, there are actually people who do all this. It doesn't just appear and sit empty when you walk past it. There are people, having all of this stuff happen. And so I tried really hard to get all of that high vis out of that skip, and got quite far, but I think the foreman thought I was a bit weird, and he just never replied to me. And so it became a bit of an artist obsession that I wanted to get high vis and work with high vis, even though I didn't quite know what I was going to do with it. Which brings us on to the new material. So my first stack of high vis came from Arts and Culture. We had a shout out at the university, and the grounds team kindly donated, I don't remember how many garments, but it was 2 big IKEA bags full. So I just kind of took it on and started playing around with it to see what I could do. And the other new material I brought in was event banners. So for some strange reason, they just kept coming to me. They just were getting abandoned, and I was kind of finding them, and then people started saying they had some. So I had a whole bunch of those donated from the Exeter Phoenix, and I also picked some at work where I work at the RAM, and I just started to use them. Similar to the Monoflex, they're really great to print onto. They don't have that translucency, but I can still layer my prints, but the image quality is a little bit better, so I do quite like it. With the high-vis, I kind of took two routes. The first route was to just fold the garments until I had a shape that I enjoyed. A lot of the garments that I got from the grounds team were obviously outdoor jackets, and they all came with hoods, and I quite like this idea of folding the garment into the hood and creating this kind of head shape. I then started to realise that I could manipulate the way that I folded into the hood to have certain parts of the garment on the outside, and I became particularly interested in the cuffs and the bits of kind of muck that come around the cuffs, because again they really kind of highlighted the idea of hands, labour, people working, and it kind of highlighted all those stains and bits of dirt and pockets full of tobacco that came with the material as I collected it. And then the other route I took was to create folded stacks and kind of binding them together with cut out parts of the materials that we're using to make kind of like parcels. I have really enjoyed actually just using the garments by themselves, so I don't cut them up or take them apart. I kind of use them as they are, and for me that's quite an interesting way to represent what I've kind of been donated. And the reclaimed event banners have become really useful because I can either use them as a whole, so make a print on the event banner and have it as one long thing, so some of them are up to 3 or 4 meters long, or I can cut them up into different canvases and print on them and make additions, which is kind of more of a traditional printmaking technique. And you can see here I've melded the two, so the event banners and the high-vis have kind of come together. So some of the forms that I made with those initial high-vis jackets are now printed onto the event banners, and there's actually 90 of those prints in total. I'll let you read that for a little second. So as I've never used clothing before, I'd never used high-vis before, I kind of use fluorescent colours, but that was kind of the extent of it. I got to a point where I was really uncertain as to whether it was actually any good or if I was kind of moving in the right direction. And it's kind of one of those artist things, you kind of just have to trust your instinct and you just have to make things and see what happens. And then I read this short passage in one of Ian Dawson's books, which will be at the exhibition, so if you want to have a flick through it, you can come and see that. But it just really validated all of the decisions that I'd made. So things like intuitive responses, unfamiliarity, they were all words that kind of screamed at me, and it was exactly what I was doing, and so it kind of gave me this second win that I was kind of on the right path. And then the other thing that I've been thinking about for the exhibition are ideas surrounding display, and how I can bring the labour that I put into work and the way that I experience my work as I'm making it into the show. So some of the exhibition techniques I'll use are things like the stored forms. So those shapes and forms that you saw in the garden shed will probably appear. That will be a way of displaying the work. Expanding the forms, so again similar to what I have done, showing you the same material in 2 different ways. The mass display of printed series. So traditionally a printmaker will make a series of prints, find the best few, sign them, number them, put them in a frame, hang them on a wall. But for me, that doesn't really work. I want you to see everything that I've done because I want you to see how much work has gone into it. So I'm likely to show all 90 prints in one go. So similar to the work you saw in correspondence, I made 200 prints that were shown in 2 bundles of 100 each. So you kind of got an idea of how much work had gone into it. In some ways I sacrifice quality for quantity, but I am working on it. The event banners have helped. And then the other thing that I really want to look at is representing materials that I'm donated and showing them in a fresh way. So it is at this point that the video won't play because I brought the wrong adapter, but essentially the drying rack on the right hand side, you can see that that is actually full of prints, and the video would play to show me taking them all out and actually how much room 90 prints takes up. When you go to an exhibition, you see prints hanging on a wall, you don't really get a sense of how much time and effort and how much space it takes to make those prints. So hopefully in the show you'll get a sense of that. And then this, again, is a video that won't play, but it is a test piece of printed plastic dropping onto the floor and creating a pile of printed plastic, basically, as a way of kind of replicating what I'd seen across the road. And that is also a video that won't play. So the final thing that I needed to think about was how I would translate my artist labour and also the labour that you can see kind of ingrained in the materials into the show. And hopefully it will come through with the repetition of images and forms, through the qualities of the material which come to me. So as I say, a lot of them come with stains, tears, dirt, some of them smell. I purposely asked not to have them cleaned when they're brought to me. So some of the jackets I got from the university have got names written in them. I know that someone called Chloe works on the team. There's tobacco in the pockets, bits of plastic, so they've literally come off and come to me, and I think that's a really important thing to try and translate into the show. And then finally, the types of materials, to speak of the labour and the intense places that they come from. So with high vis, we tend to think of building sites, factories, we think of workers, people that are kind of, they fade into the background, we don't really see them, but the clothes they wear are supposed to highlight who they are, and there's these kind of, interesting conversations with how high vis translates as a human form. And that is me. So yes, that's just information about the exhibition, and I think we're moving into conversation.
Yeah, so I think, well, given time-wise, should we stay where we are?
Yeah.
So it's very sort of 2020 distance conversation, but we'll think of it as a conversation. Thank you very much to both you. Every time I listen to artists talk, I just love getting that insight into how you both see the world and things that others might walk past. You know, the way you say girder with so much love. And it's wonderful because we're surrounded by girders and we don't appreciate them. And I think that opportunity to look again, look with fresh eyes, make something familiar, unfamiliar, is such a gift that artists bring. You know, it offers all of us an opportunity to look in new ways. So I'm going to ask a few questions, open it up to the floor. So many things I can't ask. We'll run out of time, that's fine. So labour, which is totally central to the theme of the show, and I think when you think of the word of labour, labourers, labouring, it's very physically demanding, and also there is this really artificial head, heart, hand separation that it's sort of thought to be manual labour, for example, and the kind of work that happens there. And when you think of the work of the artist, I'm afraid there's a lot of folk who don't work in the arts who sort of think of the beret and the Garratt and floating around and taking too much absinthe and, you know, a deeply outdated understanding of what artists do. And so I'm really fascinated, both of you, you've spoken about the incredibly time-intensive aspects of your work, and the importance of that, and also the word embodied. You know, it's a physical relationship that you're having with these materials to transform them. So could you talk just a little bit perhaps around either the theme of time and the importance of investing time for you, or that embodied aspect, like what is the physical price that you pay in making these objects? So maybe Laura, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I suppose I always felt like I had to make it really clear that loads of time had gone into these objects because I'm effectively making art out of someone's old clothes that's full of holes and that's no good for anyone. So, you know, as an artist, you're constantly being asked to question the value of what you're making. You're obviously being asked to place a monetary value onto it quite often, whether that's in the form of funding or pricing your work, whatever. And so it's like the value of your own time and the objects that you're making is something that is always being scrutinised. But also, as well, thinking about time and value, I kind of feel like for me, I'm constantly thinking about the people who made the clothing originally. And you know, when you think about this idea of kind of working efficiently and about how you've got to kind of think about how all the actions that you're doing have to be attributed to a certain amount of time, and then how do you make it more efficient and more efficient. And you know, I've definitely worked in various jobs over the years where people are constantly making you kind of do things faster, do things more efficiently. And so I suppose for me, I'm always trying to push back against that, especially being considerate of the bodies who made the materials and who made the garments before they came into my possession, and thinking about the bodies and the labour and the experiences of the people who wore them as well. So I suppose for me, the idea of value and time really kind of ties into that idea of labour as well. And I mean, I suppose for you, you're obviously using like work clothes.
Yeah.
So is that something that you think about as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as I said, the work clothes are quite new, but I have always kind of chosen materials from that kind of environment. So I think initially for me it was more about what I could do with the materials and how I could convert what is typically deemed as waste. So with that skip, pretty much all of that's probably gone to landfill. I know it says coastal recycling on it, but I don't quite know how they separate all of that. So for me it was more about the place where the materials come, and it's actually really for this exhibition where the thought of people and like the human form has kind of come into it. I think as well because my work has always kind of been a bigger scale than human scale. But I think, as I was going to say, in terms of like the labour for me, it kind of comes into kind of my own physical work and how I have to work, because like most artists you have to have a job and then you have your practice on top of that, and so it's kind of managing that and not becoming too laboured down by the fact that you're tired enough to work and then on your day off you have to make work, especially when it's kind of quite a physical work like what you do and printing. So yeah, it kind of feeds into my own kind of personal labour as well.
Yeah, I mean, I love how there are so many, labour just goes all the way through, and that kind of layering up of labour. And now I've just got totally sidetracked by another thought. Sarah, bring it back, focus. With the materials that you work with, and Laura, you spoke about the energy and the relationship between the body and materials, and I found, personally, I had not experienced this until I went to a ceramics workshop, and a ceramicist spoke about the clay and the personality of the clay. And if you try to make clay do something it doesn't want to do, the clay will win and you will lose. And I found that fascinating, how you can kind of, if you're not listening to it, it will just not cooperate. And that really brought home for me the first time this conversation with materials, which sounds very arty, but it really is. It's like, if you're not listening to what the material's telling you, it's not going to work. And I can see in both of your practices, you're following the material. So could you speak a little bit about what that relationship is? What the sort of, when you're working with different kinds of material, perhaps how it's a different way of working, and how you sort of, do you follow that material's lead, or are you kind of putting an idea onto the material? Sort of, what is the nature of that conversation?
I think I very much start with putting an idea onto a material. So I came to plastic sheeting because I knew it was a surface that I could print onto. But because it's got this really fine weave in it, actually it doesn't lie flat, and so the prints aren't amazing. So that's when listening to the material came in, and I had to kind of change my practice slightly to accommodate that, which is why the event banners have come in, because they provide the same quality of kind of hanging things, cutting them up, but they just provide a so yeah, it's kind of a bit of both. I think I kind of project first and then work with what I've got.
Yeah, I think at the moment, with kind of the way that I'm working with materials, kind of cutting them down, I suppose it feels a bit ruthless in a way, but I have actually started to kind of really become sensitive to what materials, textiles feels like, and actually you get so many different blends, and I don't have loads of control over. I've got the formula of kind of the ratios of water and the different kind of things that I mix it with to then make it a solid material. But actually every single item of clothing that I mix with those things, it dries different, it's very much like clay, it's got different shrinkage rates, some really crack, some just like really kind of shrink down and become very, very hard, some still are very kind of bitty and don't hold their form that much, and I don't really feel, even though I'm very, very measured to like the gram of every material that I kind of mix the clothing with, and that always stays the same, I don't feel like I have any real control over what the end product is. But I love that in art making. I really like the feeling that you're kind of relinquishing control. I don't really want to be somebody who kind of just like manipulates a material to do exactly what I want it to do. I don't think that we should ever really have control over another material necessarily in that way. Maybe that's going back to this weird idea I have of materials absorbing their own or developing their own kind of consciousness. But I think for me, it's important that it still has its own journey that it takes, without me, really. I don't know.
It's quite interesting as well. I think we talked about this before, but because most of the materials we get given to us, you kind of get that reputation for the person to give this to.
Yeah.
And so you end up losing control because people will start to give you things that maybe you don't want, but they think you want. And so you end up getting things introduced that you might not necessarily actually want, but you then kind of feel responsible for.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that can really affect actually how you kind of go forward with things and how you kind of like do your fake smile to be like, thanks.
Yeah, and I think we also like to, not create any kind of waste, so you will use anything that you're given, whether it's kind of suitable or not.
Yeah.
But it's it kind of always ends up being in the work.
We scheduled this talk for an hour, and it's 7:30 now. So, if anyone does need to get away promptly, we appreciate that. But if there are any questions from the floor before we wrap up, anything that you just love Laura and Adam to talk about a bit more, Dan.
Yeah, a very, 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 very short, quick question, but I don't think there's really a very quick answer to it. But how do you think that embodied labour also embodies meaning?
Phew. Yeah, just go with an easy one.
I thought I'd throw you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're using recycled materials, what you're actually using is something that is completely enriched with its own history, and with history comes context, and with context comes meaning, I guess. And so for me, when I write my little materials list, which I'm always adamant that there has to be a materials list, just using the word sort of, I think I normally say something silly like hand-cut reclaimed clothing, but just by using that word clothing, you're actually asking other people to reflect what that means to them onto the material. And with recycled clothing as well, depending on where you are in the world, there's going to be lots of different kind of personal experiences people have with that. When I was at Documenta, there was one of the video pieces there was called, I think it was called something like The Problem with Second-Hand Clothing, and it was about how lots of countries in the West are just sending massive quantities of clothing that actually can't be worn anymore. You know, they're saying it's been donated, but it's already gone through a million different processes of going to charity shops and then being donated in various different places until it's being effectively dumped on people who, you know, we're then just giving somebody else a waste material and a problem. And so, yeah, it's really interesting when you talk about clothing, and actually the clothing industry is so vast that for me, kind of using a material that is so rich means that it will mean something different to everyone who kind of interacts with it. And also from a kind of just a visual aspect. I mean, I know in that quote you said, it said something about unfamiliarity. And I do think unfamiliarity is really important in art making, but I think the familiar is also really important, because for me, I really like there to be a relationship to the everyday in my work, and I really like there to be familiar elements. And so the idea of kind of embodying something means it's kind of embodying life in a way, and I think that's what I would definitely like to kind of try and include that duality in my work.
Yeah, I think I just try not to shy away from the kind of the ugly parts of the things that are given to me. So I kind of embrace the holes and the stains and all the things that come on the materials that I'm given. To be very short, thank you, Alison.
Yeah.
I'm also not sure that questions as perhaps observations. Thanks for the talk. It's been good to hear. It strikes me that in the practice of art making, it's sometimes a bit of an invisible that a central part of what the work is to be present with the process, is to learn, try and teach ourselves how to see differently, how to engage differently, and how to trust that process. And in today's world, that really is work, because the weird comments you get from people when you forage for crap in the street, I know it well. And you know, you've got to, that's work, that's performance, to put yourself through that, in my experience, to have, I find it hard to have to sort of do something against the grain. And I feel like there are important things to do, because what we're trying to do through that process is discover that there is meaning in lots of other things which conventional stories in our culture perhaps would say would not even notice that there is meaning to be discovered in infinite subtle gestures and ephemera that are all around us. A piece of fallen tarp, you can discover all kinds of fascinations in. And so I'd just like to congratulate you for those bits of labour that are there. I remember my tutor telling us this story once. He was out with his notebook in the street somewhere, and in his hometown, and one of some old acquaintance came up and just chatted with him and said, "So, are you working at the moment?" And he was just like, "I'm working right now," as it turns out. And with a sort of, but it sometimes can be hard for people to understand art making as work, because of the stories that are told about how we understand work, which puts us on the fringe, which means that it's a struggle to find a studio. And there's a sort of, I also liked your quote that you had up from, I forget the guy. Yeah. This one. To me, I think it begins to open up somewhere where I've kind of pursued in my sense making around working with the artistic process, working with trying to recognise our intuitions and be led by those things, and allow those things to become what validates things. And of course, again, to me, it comes down to the other ways of knowing, the other capacities that we have, but that we don't necessarily all live by in today's culture, but nonetheless, once you start tuning into them and start giving them your power, then we discover there's so much there, and that if you can find something that feels genuine, they open themselves into quite extraordinary things. And so I really liked, well, it's present clearly in all of us as artists, but I really like to see your just like, oh shit, I've got no studio, I need some things, and then like, but to have the courage to just trust that process and go with that and allow that to open up, and before you know it, the meaning, that's a question there, what's going on with meaning? To me, if we are committed to that process, the meaning unfolds through the work, and sometimes it feels a bit like people expect artists to sort of tag some meaning onto it, but actually it's sort of there in the heart of it, if only we can hold that at the centre. So I don't know other questions, they're observations anyway.
That is great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, hey. So good. I get from both your practices a sense of fragmented identity, especially that of working class, with like the materials, reusing and recycling clothes is quite a working class kind of thing. The materials that you're using of workmanship as labour, and the act of repetition is very indicative of working class. Like being working class, you have so many repetitions throughout your whole life, from work cycles to where you live and return back. And I just wanted to ask, like, how has, because you mentioned it in the bio before, how's working class informed your practice, and what does both your work say about working classes?
I think, like you said, it comes through in those repeat processes. It's the kind of thing you experience in your everyday life if you have a working class job, or those kinds of familiarities. And I think a lot of repetition has come through for me in one of my really early inspirations, things that drove my practice, was architecture, and particularly kind of concrete architecture that was made in form, so you have the same thing made over and over again that kind of creates a building. And again, they're always in working class areas, usually. Definitely where I grew up, and so I think it kind of grounds me a little bit in where I grew up, and I think it translates into that repetition for me.
I don't know if there's a kind of working class identity that comes out in my practice as much as a female identity for me, maybe. I'm very short, I'm 5 foot, and I've always been told I look very young, and one of the first things people would always say to me is, oh, you're very small. And I feel like I've often been kind of shoehorned into this kind of image of a person that's just very weak, I don't know, or very, I've always liked the idea of doing kind of manual work, and I am lucky that in more recent times I have been able to kind of work on building sites or in workshops, but the way a lot of technicians used to treat me was like, oh no, you can't cut the wood and stuff like that, and it's always more of a, I think with my ideas of kind of repetition and this kind of really labour intensive way of working kind of came from me being like, well, I want to work really hard, I want to be really physical, because people would kind of be like, you're not a physical person. I don't know, it's just a bit, I've never really thought about it much before, because I don't really include my identity as a woman kind of in the core of my practice, but I do think a lot of how I have been treated in certain manual roles in the past has kind of made me want to work harder or kind of prove that I've got some kind of strength in some way to kind of prove people wrong. I don't know if that really relates to your question particularly, but I feel like I feel quite strong in my identity as a woman who can weld, or who can do these things, because I used to kind kind of be told, not by my dad, but I have been told, you know, before that this isn't really something that you do. I don't know if that's the same as other people's experiences. I'm sure it's something that men and women experience. I don't think it's exclusively a female thing. But yeah, if I was kind of going to push back against any kind of identity for me personally, it would be that.
Lovely. Okay, so a few things just to wrap us up. If you don't follow Studio Kind yet, get on it. They've got a fantastic newsletter that comes around with all of the activities. A reminder for your diaries, the 22nd of April to the 13th of May is when Adam's show is available to see in person. So if you can find your way to North Devon during that period, please do. And I would just like to thank Positive Light Projects very much for hosting us this evening, and the arts and culture team, Naomi, Cerise and Anna, who have all done fantastic work in the planning, marketing and delivery of the event tonight, so thank you for that. And of course, if we could have a round of applause for Laura and Adam, they're great. Lovely, cool. I think, oh yeah, arts and culture, University of Exeter.
Yeah,
Just
thank you.
all follows. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. All right, so that's us. So enjoy your evenings. Thank you very much for coming out in this terrible weather.